When you work with JavaScript in the browser, any variables that you create outside of a function are global variables, and they're accessible from anywhere else in that JavaScript file or any of the other JavaScript files that have been loaded as part of your web application. However, scope works a little bit differently in Node, and so in this lesson, we are going to learn about how Node handles JavaScript scope. So here on the desktop, I'm going to create a file that I'll just call scope-a.js. In here, we are going to create a variable and a function in three different ways. So the first way inside of a JavaScript file like this is, of course, using the var keyword. And so we'll just say var1 equals 1, and this will be our variable. And then, of course, we can create a function, and let's create a function called to, and it will just return the word to. Now, if this was a regular JavaScript file, this variable and this function would be accessible from any other files that we load into the browser. However, things work a little bit differently in Node. Now, I'm going to create a second file, and we'll call it scope-b.js. And in here, we are going to do a require, and we're going to require /scope-a. Now, the require function is something that Node gives us, which allows you to basically reference anything in another file from this current file. So here we're in scope B, and I can do require scope A, and of course we have to pass the relative path so that it knows where the scope A file is. But we can pass this to require, and we can get the contents of the scope A file. Now, I say get the contents of it. However, as we're going to see throughout this lesson, it doesn't just copy the code from scope A and kind of paste it at this line in B. It's not quite that simple. So here in B, let's do console.log1, and I'll copy this line, and we'll also do console.log2 and call that to function. So now if we go back to the command line, if I do node scope B and run the scope B file, you'll see that we get an error. It's a reference error, which tells us that 1 is not defined. So we actually cannot reference variable 1 from the scope B file, even when we require scope A. If I comment that line out and rerun the file, you'll see that we have the same error for 2. So 2 is not defined either. So what this tells us is that within Node, top-level variables and functions are not accessible from outside of this JavaScript file. Even though we have required the scope A file, we still don't have access to its variables and functions from inside scope B. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the global object, which is kind of like the top-level global namespace in Node. This is Node's version of window in the browser. And just like in the browser, where window.window equals window, global.global equals global. So it does reference itself, and it is the highest level object. And what we can do is create properties and functions off of this object, and they'll be available from other functions. So let's create a property in this way, and we can say 3. And we can do the same thing with a function. And now, over here in scope B, let's go ahead and try and use variable 3 and function 4. And if we come back to the console and rerun the file, you can see that 3 and 4 are being printed out as you might expect. So we can make global variables and global functions by adding them as properties of the global object. However, this is not really the recommended pattern in Node. Instead, what you want to do is create your own modules. And we are going to discuss all about modules in the next lesson, but you can think of a module as a collection of functionality, and it has some outward-facing API that can be accessed from outside the file. So if scope A is going to be a module, then we can make something accessible outside of this file by doing exports dot, and then we add onto this exports object. So I could say exports.5, and we will add a property, and we can do the same thing for a function. So I'll say exports6 is our function, and now we'll be able to access these from anywhere that we require our scope A file. However, we don't access them in the same way that we access 3 and 4. What happens is that when we call this require statement here, it actually returns the module object. So I can create a variable here. For example, we could call it mod A for module A. And now we can go ahead and do console.log mod A.5 to get the property that we created, or mod A.6 to call the method that we created on this module. And so now if we come back to the console and run that again, you can see that we have 5 and 6 being printed out. So this is how Node handles scope. If you're creating regular variables and functions at the top level inside of a file, they won't be accessible from other files that use that file. If you want something to be available everywhere, you can add it to the global object. However, what you'll want to do most of the time is assign properties and methods to the exports object to create a module, which you can then get the module object of when you require that file. And that is scope in Node.